Hello, yellow group, and hello, blue group, and hello, pre-Ks. I get to be the special guest reader again this week because this is one of my favorite stories. This is the story of The Real Easter Bunny by Sheila Black, pictures by Robin Officer. I wanted to read it to all the groups because it's one of my favorite Easter stories. Now, it's a pretty long one, so if you're in the yellow group, you might want to get comfy and lay down somewhere comfy to hear the story, or read it before you go to bed. Or the blue group or the pre-Ks, you might want to get comfy during this story because it's a chapter book with lots to tell you about the Easter Bunny. Are you ready? Here we go. The Real Easter Bunny. Once upon a time, there was a little rabbit named Early. He lived with his mother and his father and his three brothers, Quicksilver, Clover, and Acorn. They lived in a cozy rabbit hole at the top of a grassy hill. Early had been given his name because he was born just before dawn one Sunday morning. He'd been born too early, too. He was very small. His mother said that he would grow. One of his paws turned inward just a little, so instead of hopping straight, he kind of zigzagged from side to side. He was by far the slowest of his brothers. Quicksilver could run faster than the wind. Clover was strong and could pull carrots out of the ground quicker than the blink of an eye. And Acorn, the oldest brother, was clever. He knew all sorts of useful things, such as where to find lettuce and how to tell which way the wind was blowing. But Early was just Early. His brothers used to say that he should have been called Late. They said he was not much good at anything. He liked flowers and birds and butterflies, and he was best at sitting around and daydreaming. As he sat and gazed up at the sky, Early would make up wonderful stories about the flowers that danced and talked to each other, and the colors of the rainbow, and where the snowflakes came from. "I don't know what I will do with you, Early," his father said. "You're such a daydreamer." But his mother said Early would be just fine. He was good-natured. He was a nice little rabbit, and that's all that mattered. Early liked making up stories, and he liked listening to stories too. His Aunt Sophia was a famous storyteller. In the evening, all the rabbits on the grassy hill used to gather around her. She would tell stories about faraway lands, strange animals, and magic happenings. Early loved all of her stories, but his very favorite was the story of the real, true Easter Bunny. There really was an Easter Bunny. All the young rabbits had heard about him. He was the most famous rabbit of all. Every year on Easter Sunday, he traveled the world bringing eggs to all of the children. Aunt Sophia had actually seen the Easter Bunny once when she was very young. Early made her tell about it over and over and over again. It happened just after sunrise one Easter morning. Aunt Sophia had gone out very early, and she'd seen him on the horizon. He had been just a flash of white on the hillside, for the Easter Bunny was the fastest rabbit in the entire world. But she had seen that he was carrying a basket filled with eggs that gleamed like jewels. One night, when they were all gathered around, Aunt Sophia told the young rabbits something wonderful. When the Easter Bunny grew too old and too tired, she said, he would choose a new Easter Bunny from all of the best rabbits in the whole wide world. Quicksilver, Clover, and Acorn lifted their heads proudly. They were surely among the best young rabbits in the world. But Early just looked at the ground. The best? No, he wasn't the best at anything. Then Aunt Sophia asked all the young rabbits what they'd like to be when they grew up. Quicksilver said he'd like to be the fastest rabbit in the world. Clover said he would like to be the strongest rabbit in the world. Acorn said he wanted to be the cleverest rabbit in the whole world. Aunt Sophia nodded. She turned to Early and asked, "What about you?" Early's ears turned pink. I don't know. I think I'd like to be the Easter Bunny," he whispered shyly. He'd not meant to say it. It just popped out. Everyone laughed. "You? Why, you're the slowest. You're the weakest. The Easter Bunny doesn't just sit on a hillside and look up at the sky. He's the fastest rabbit in the world. You could never be the Easter Bunny." Early's ears turned a dark pink. The seasons passed. Early grew, but not very much. Everyone agreed that he was rather small for a rabbit who was almost grown up. Now his brother Quicksilver, he was almost twice his size. He could run across a grassy hill in a flash. Clover was almost 3 times his size. As big as a cat, the other rabbit said admiringly. He could pull the largest carrot out of the ground with no trouble at all. And as for Acorn, he was so clever that everyone on the hill asked his advice about all sorts of things. How to find the way home in a blizzard or escape from a hunter. But people just smiled at Early. He's sweet-natured, everyone said, but with a limp like that, they shrugged. Early did not have anything he was very good at. In the morning, he could be seen sitting, watching everything. In the springtime, he looked at the first leaves that appeared on the trees and saw the tiny shoots of grass grow out of the ground. In the summer, he smelled the heather and watched the sleepy dragonflies gather over the pond at the bottom of the hill. In the fall, he watched the birds fly south and the leaves change from green to red to gold. He was often lonely, for the other rabbits seemed to be growing up and doing brand new things. But for Early, nothing changed. Chapter 2, A Stranger. One December evening around Christmas time, a group of rabbits huddled under the elm tree. The winter had been worse than usual, and the rabbits had only a few bits of potato left to eat. They were all feeling cold and a little bad-tempered. Suddenly, Acorn hopped up with a cry. "A stranger! A stranger! A stranger's coming up over the hill!" As the stranger came closer, they all could see that he was very old. He was perfectly white, and his fur shone against the snow with a silvery glow. "Good evening," the stranger said in a deep voice. The rabbits of the grassy knoll looked at him. "I'm wondering if you could give me a meal and maybe a bed for the night," he said. "I've traveled very far." Now the rabbits could see that he was shabbily dressed. His blue jacket had seen better days. His ears flopped over as though that he was very, very tired. "Who are you, and where do you come from?" Quicksilver asked rather sternly. The stranger shrugged. "I'm a stranger," he replied. "I mean no harm, and I've been traveling a long time." "That's no business of ours," Acorn said in his most grown-up tone of voice. "I'm afraid we cannot help you. We barely have enough food for ourselves." The other rabbits nodded in agreement. "And as for a bed," Acorn continued, "why should we take in a stranger who wouldn't even tell us who he is?" The other rabbits nodded again. They all felt there must be something odd about a stranger who appeared from nowhere. They all moved closer together in a circle, turning their backs on the stranger. All except for Early. He'd been quietly watching the stranger. There was something in the stranger's eyes that made Early want to speak to him. Early had never before seen a rabbit with eyes like that. They were as blue as the sky. "Excuse me," Early began, hopping a step or two towards the stranger. "We have room in." But at that moment, Clover reached over and cuffed him by the ears, knocking him backwards. "What are you doing?" Acorn said crossly. "Do you always have to be different?" Quicksilver hissed. And they stepped in front of Early and glared at the stranger, who turned and hopped away into the icy night. As soon as the stranger left, it began to snow. The rabbits gathered together and formed a tight circle against the sharp wind. The snowflakes fell more and more heavily. Slowly, the rabbits turned and hopped off to their warm rabbit holes. None of them spared a thought for the stranger left out alone in the storm. None of them, except for Early. "It's terrible," he murmured to himself, "for that old rabbit to be outside when it's so cold." Early peered through the darkness and falling snow. He felt he could not bear to go back home while the stranger was out alone in a storm. He sat off slowly down the hill. He was going to find the stranger and bring him home. He didn't care what the other rabbits would say. The wind whipped the snow into white clouds around him. The branches of the trees creaked and groaned. Early struggled down the hillside. The woods at the bottom of the hill were silent except for the moan of the wind. All of the animals had taken shelter from the bad storm. Early hopped along as quickly as he could. The snow was falling so hard he began to wonder how he could ever find the stranger. He kept going. He'd never been so far from home before, all alone. He looked around, but none of the trees looked familiar. He was sure that he was lost in that terrible snowstorm. He stopped by a fallen tree branch. He was shivering and his fur was stiff and icy. I'll never find the stranger now, he murmured to himself. And how will I ever find my way home? Just then he heard, hello, hello. He thought he could hear an answering cry. He saw a pair of eyes moving towards him. The eyes drew closer. Early ran forwards as fast as he could. It was the old rabbit, the stranger, and he was shaking with cold. It's you, Early cried. I've been looking all over for you. Early was not certain that he would be able to find his home again, but with the stranger beside him, he just seemed to know the way to go. They went slowly through the storm to the warmth and safety of Early's rabbit hole. Early slept near the door and let the stranger have his bed. When he woke up the next morning, Early ran to his bedroom to see if the stranger was still there, but he was gone. Early asked his brothers about the stranger, but they just stared at him. You know, he left last night, they told him. Why would it have come back again? They didn't know that Early had brought the stranger back to his rabbit hole. Early didn't understand why the stranger had left without saying goodbye. Sorrowfully, he went back to his room and pushed open the door. There, on the freshly made bed, he saw a small package wrapped in brown paper. To Early, he read on the card, from a friend. He tore the paper off the package. Inside was a small egg made of green stone. The color was deep and fresh, like the first spring grass. The green egg glinted in the light. Early did not want to tell anyone about the stranger's gift. The egg gave him a special feeling that was his alone. Carefully, he wrapped it up again and hid it under the mattress. Sometimes, when no one was around, he'd take it out and look at it. It reminded him of springtime and summer and the days when the world was green and bright. Chapter 3, The Easter Bunny. Winter passed, and spring came to the grassy hill. The tips of the trees were turning pale green, and the smell of new grass was in the air. Soon after the first flowers bloomed, some exciting news came to the rabbits of the grassy hill. A messenger dressed very finely came and read a proclamation. The Easter Bunny has decided that he's too old to perform his duties anymore. He's choosing a new Easter Bunny to take his place. Quicksilver, Clover, and Acorn could talk of nothing else. Each morning, Quicksilver practiced running. He ran faster and faster and faster till he looked like a flash of light from the hillside. Clover built up his strength until he could turn over big stones with just a single paw. Acorn spoke to all the wise old rabbits. He was trying to improve his knowledge so that he would be the cleverest young rabbit in the world. Early, however, just continued to be polite and to offer help whenever it was needed. When his work was done, he sat under the elm tree and made up stories. Sometimes the younger rabbits asked him to tell them his stories, which they loved. And though he was still rather shy, he did. He hoped that one of his brothers might become the new Easter Bunny. They were so talented, he was sure that one of them would surely get chosen. March, then, came, followed by April. Quicksilver could outrun all the other rabbits, even ones from the next hill. Clover, without a question, was the strongest rabbit around, and everyone agreed that Acorn was awfully clever. Any one of them would certainly make a good Easter Bunny, the rabbits of the hill said proudly. But no one thought of Early. One morning, towards the end of April, Aunt Sophia cried out that a procession was coming towards the grassy hill. As all the rabbits gathered and looked on, a group of finely dressed rabbits came climbing up the hill. At their head was a very noble rabbit indeed. The rabbits of the hill whispered to each other that it could be none other than the Easter Bunny himself. His silver white fur gleamed in the sunlight. His waistcoat was the color of the new grass. His jacket was a sky blue, and in his paws he carried a silver basket filled with colored eggs of all kinds. The rabbits of the grassy knoll crowded around the visitor. Quicksilver, Clover, and Acorn were first among them. They were wearing their finest clothes. Each was secretly sure that he was the chosen one. The procession came to a stop. The Easter Bunny stepped forward. I'm pleased to say that the new Easter Bunny has been chosen from amongst you, he began. He is the best of all the rabbits I came across in my journeys. He knows who he is because I gave him a token of my friendship, an egg carved out of green stone. The rabbits looked at each other in confusion. None of them had ever seen an egg like that. There was a long silence. At last, Early stepped forward shyly. I beg your pardon, sir. I have a green egg, like the one you mentioned. It was a gift from a stranger. But perhaps he made a mistake. He took the green egg from his pocket and handed it to the Easter Bunny. The Easter Bunny clapped him on the shoulders. "Don't you recognize me?" he asked. And looking up at his blue eyes, Early saw that the rabbit was none other than the stranger he had met on that cold winter night so many months ago. That night, the rabbits of the hills celebrated. No one could believe that it was Early who was to be the new Easter Bunny. His brothers were sure that somehow a mistake had been made. Only his mother and Aunt Sophia were not surprised. "I always said you were so kind-hearted," his mother said. "I always said that that was more important than anything else." The rabbits of the hillside had danced and eaten into the night. Now they were tired. Some of them were falling asleep under the stars. Early was looking up at the sky. He heard the voice of the Easter Bunny beside him. "It's time for us to go," he said. Early turned to look at him. "Are you sure I'm the one?" he asked quietly. "I can hardly run at all, you know." "It doesn't matter," the Easter Bunny answered. "You're the one." He reached over and touched Early on the shoulder with his silver cane. Suddenly, Early felt his legs and paws start to tingle. He felt as though he could run as fast as anything. He looked sadly at the grassy hill, but he knew it was time to go. The two rabbits set off together along the hillside. At first, Early was slightly slower than the Easter Bunny, but after a moment or two, he drew even with him. They ran faster and faster till they were no more than a flash of white on the hillside. The rabbits on the grassy hill watched them go with a happy feeling in their hearts. If one Easter Sunday you see a rabbit carrying a basket full of colored eggs, you'll know that he's the Easter Bunny. And although his story took place many years ago, it may well be Early himself. He's much older now, of course, and he's still a daydreamer. And sometimes, when he's tired, one paw will turn in just a little, just as it did a long time ago on the green, grassy hill. Oh, I hope you enjoyed my story of the real, true Easter Bunny. Happy Easter!